The expensive crystal stemware trembled as my father's hand came down hard against a mahogany table. We were in the most exclusive private dining room in the city, the kind of place where deals were made and family legacies were decided. My father, Walter Thorne, sat at the head of the table in his custom-tailored suit, his face already flushed from expensive wine and the pleasure of public cruelty. I am Daniel Thorne, 35 years old, architectural engineer by training, unpaid maintenance man by family obligation, emotional punching bag by design. I had just finished explaining the technical failure of my architectural project, a residential development I had designed with my own capital, financed by my life savings and a mortgage on my modest home. The project had collapsed when the site's soil composition turned out to be unstable, a geological survey I couldn't have predicted. It had cost me everything. Instead of the comfort I desperately craved from my family, my father pointed his finger at me across that pristine white tablecloth, his voice loud enough for the hovering waiter to hear. "You see, Daniel, this failure proves it," he sneered. "You are too soft. You've always been a financial burden and a disappointment. No discipline, no vision." My mother, Amelia, immediately leaned over and patted my sister Vivian on the arm. Her voice became sickeningly sweet, the tone she reserved for moments of maximum cruelty. "We're updating our will," she announced, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "We decided to leave the entire estate, the factory land, the house, everything, to Vivian. She's the only one capable of preserving the Thorne legacy." My sister smiled, that smug, superior smile I had seen 1,000 times across 35 years of family dinners. The smile that said, "I always knew I was a favorite. Now everyone knows it too." The taste of my perfectly cooked steak turned to ash in my mouth. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I simply set down my fork and looked at my father with an expression of absolute stillness. "I understand," I said quietly. "I'm glad we had this conversation." But inside, I was already calculating, because I knew something my family didn't. I knew the greatest secret Thorne Industries had ever kept, and I was the only one who understood its true cost. For 5 years, I had kept the Thorne Industries factory from complete collapse. The sprawling manufacturing plant sat on the edge of the city like a sleeping giant. Acres of corroded metal buildings, aging machinery that wheezed through production cycles, and a history that went back 60 years. My parents had always called it the family legacy. My father had taken it over from his father with grand promises of modernization and expansion. Instead, it had slowly rotted. When I came home 5 years ago, pulled away from a promising career in New York after my mother called crying about my father's health, I discovered that the factory wasn't just aging. It was catastrophically failing. The structural integrity of the main warehouse had degraded. The electrical systems were fire hazards. And nobody knew what to do about any of it, except me. I was an architectural engineer. I had been offered a partnership at a prestigious firm in Manhattan, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. Instead, I walked away from it because my mother's voice on the phone that day had been so convincing, so desperate, so loving. "Daniel, please," she had begged. "Your father needs you. The factory needs you. Your sister can't handle this." So I came home, and I never left. For 5 years, I designed and installed structural supports to keep the warehouse from collapsing. I rewired electrical systems to pass safety inspections. I maintained ancient machinery that should have been replaced a decade earlier. I worked without pay, without credit, without recognition. I told myself it was temporary, that once I stabilized things, I would go back to New York, back to my career, back to my own life. But every time I earned a decent contract, consulting work I did on weekends, my parents had a family emergency, a tax bill they couldn't pay, a medical scare that required expensive testing. Each time, they called me to their office with tears in their eyes and asked me to empty my savings to save them. Each time, I said yes. My father called it family responsibility. My mother called it love. I eventually understood it as what it truly was: calculated manipulation designed to keep me poor, dependent, and forever grateful. They kept me close by ensuring I could never afford to leave. My sister, Vivian, was the golden child in every way that mattered to my parents. She was charming in public and mercenary in private, loud where I was quiet, demanding where I was accommodating. She was married to Royce Castellano, a smooth-talking real estate contractor with slick back hair and the kind of smile that made you want to check your wallet after shaking his hand. Vivian spent her days ordering expensive furniture for the family home and telling everyone at country clubs that she was managing the brand of Thorn Industries. In reality, she spent most of her time avoiding the factory entirely. What I eventually discovered was that she and Royce were methodically bleeding the company dry. Royce would create fake construction contracts for the factory's modernization. Vivian would approve them with forged signatures and my father's outdated company stamp. The money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, would flow into accounts that Royce controlled. Then they would take out high-interest business loans against the factory as collateral, loans they had no intention of repaying. They were destroying Thorn Industries not out of incompetence, but out of deliberate, calculated greed. My parents knew. At first, I didn't believe it. But as I began to understand the financial patterns, as I saw the bank statements and the forged invoices and the shell companies Royce had created, I realized the truth. My father and mother weren't victims of Vivian's schemes. They were conspirators. They wanted the factory to fail so they could sell the land. The land beneath the factory, 60 acres of prime commercial real estate, was worth millions, enough to retire wealthy, enough to rebuild their lives entirely. The only problem was that the factory still occupied it, and I was the only thing keeping that factory operational. Every time I fixed the roof, every time I reinforced the beams, every time I kept the machinery running, I was keeping their retirement plan trapped in place. Because no developer would buy the land as long as a functioning factory sat on it, and no buyer would purchase a factory with a brilliant structural engineer running it. But a factory on the verge of collapse, a factory with failing systems and deteriorating infrastructure, that could be demolished, cleared, sold for development. My parents had been waiting 5 years for me to either leave or die trying. The morning after the disinheritance dinner, my mother called. Her voice was sweet and manipulative in a way that had become instantly recognizable to me over the past 5 years. Daniel, darling, don't be dramatic about the will. It's just paperwork. You know how much we rely on you. The West Wing, the structural beams look odd. We need you at the factory today. Please. It's urgent. She didn't apologize for calling me a burden. She didn't acknowledge the humiliation of the previous evening. She simply assumed that I would return to the factory the next day and resume my unpaid work, as if nothing had happened. My immediate reaction was pure, cold refusal. I opened my mouth to tell her no, but then a thought struck me with the force of absolute clarity. I needed more time inside that factory. I needed access to places I had overlooked for 5 years. I needed to understand something that had haunted me since I first came home, something I had found and then deliberately forgotten. Something that scared me enough that I had never investigated further. I'll be there this afternoon, I told her. Thorn Industries sat on the edge of the industrial district, like a rusting monument to failed ambitions. The main building was a massive corrugated metal warehouse, 5 stories tall, its paint peeling in long strips that looked like diseased skin. Smaller outbuildings clustered around it. Storage facilities, maintenance sheds, a security office that hadn't been staffed since 2008. Behind the main warehouse, separated by a chain-link fence that had collapsed in several places, was the back lot, 30 acres of cracked asphalt, scattered with debris, and dotted with old storage drums that had been there so long that nobody remembered what was inside them. I had always avoided the back lot when I could. That afternoon, I went directly to the basement of the main warehouse and found what I had been avoiding for 5 years, a filing cabinet in a forgotten corner, filled with faded regulatory documents from the 1980s. The papers were so old that they crumbled when I touched them, but I could read enough. Environmental Compliance Filing, 1983. Industrial Chemical Storage Protocols. Heavy Metal Waste Disposal Procedures. Notice of Improperly Stored Solvent Containers, 1986. Environmental Quality Board. Urgent. Inventory of Buried Hazardous Materials, 1989. The back lot wasn't just a storage area. It was a hazardous waste site. Decades ago, when Thorn Industries operated at full capacity, the factory had been a heavy manufacturing plant. They used industrial solvents, toxic chemicals, and heavy metals in their production processes. And when environmental regulations became stricter in the 1980s, instead of properly disposing of the waste, they had buried it. Literally buried it under the concrete in the back lot. For 30 years, those chemicals had been leaching into the groundwater beneath the factory. For 30 years, the land had been becoming increasingly toxic. And for 5 years, I had been maintaining a factory built on top of an environmental time bomb. My hands shook as I photographed every document, every faded filing. I understood immediately what this meant. If the land were ever sold for development, if a housing development or shopping center were built on top of that contaminated soil, the cleanup costs would be astronomical. Millions of dollars, possibly tens of millions. The land my parents were so desperately trying to sell was worthless, and they didn't know I knew. I spent the next 2 weeks collecting evidence. I obtained a geotechnical survey kit through an old university colleague and took it to the factory under the pretense of checking the structural load on the west wing, exactly as my mother had requested. While I appeared to be working on the beams, I was actually taking soil core samples from strategic points around the backlot, drilling deep into the earth in locations indicated by the old regulatory filings. The samples I collected would be irrefutable proof. I labeled each one professionally: depth, location, collection date, time. I photographed the surrounding area. I documented the state of the old storage drums. I took video footage of the faded environmental markings still visible on the warehouse exterior, warnings that had been painted over decades ago, but were still partially visible if you knew where to look. Then I placed every sample, every photograph, every document into a secure lockbox that I hid in my home office. I wasn't collecting this evidence for my parents. I wasn't trying to save the factory or protect Thorn Industries. I was building a case, not for prosecution, but for protection. I was creating a shield. 2 weeks after I began collecting evidence, Vivian and Royce showed up at the factory together. They were laughing as they walked through the main warehouse, and I could hear their voices echoing off the metal walls. "Don't worry, Daniel," Vivian called out when she saw me working on a reinforcement beam. "Once we sell, we might even give you a generous bonus for all your hard work patching this old dump up." Royce smirked at me with the kind of cruelty that comes from believing you won. I forced a polite smile. "That's very generous," I said, but inside I was calculating. Inside, I was watching Royce move through the factory with the confidence of someone who already owned it. Inside, I was understanding that I had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the land deal would be finalized and the factory would be sold. I needed to move faster. That evening, I drove out to the back lot and installed something I had been planning for weeks: a small high-definition security camera, disguised as a broken light fixture on the edge of the warehouse, with a clear view of the back lot and the old storage drums. The camera connected to an encrypted server that I accessed remotely using a VPN. If anything happened, if Vivian tried to clear the drums, if Royce attempted to hide evidence, if my parents decided to take action based on what they might discover, I would have documentation. But more importantly, I needed to see what was about to happen, because I had discovered something else during my research, something that changed everything. It was 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening when I watched the security camera feed. Royce's truck was parked in the back lot. My mother's luxury sedan was parked beside it, and through the infrared camera, I could see 2 figures moving together in the darkness, their bodies close, intimate. My mother and Royce, locked in an embrace. I watched for 30 seconds, long enough to be absolutely certain. Then I closed the laptop. The betrayal was so complete that I felt almost nothing. No shock, no anger, just a hollow confirmation of something I had suspected but refused to acknowledge. My mother was having an affair with my sister's husband. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about greed. This was a complete moral collapse. My mother had conspired with Royce to deceive my father, to cheat my sister, and to betray the entire family structure. And my father, who must have suspected something was wrong, was too proud or too blind to face it. Everything was rotten. Not just the factory, not just the land, The entire Thorne family was built on lies and corruption. I understood then what I needed to do. I needed to burn it all down. But I needed to be smart about it. I needed to make sure I survived the fire. 3 days later, I called an old university colleague named Miles Chun. Miles had become an environmental law attorney at one of the most prestigious firms in the state. He was brilliant, ethical, and completely trustworthy. We met at a quiet cafe on the opposite side of the city, far from anyone who might recognize us. I laid out a hypothetical scenario. I described a manufacturing facility that had been operating since the 1960s. I described the improper disposal of industrial chemicals in the 1980s and 1990s. I described soil that had never been tested, groundwater that had never been assessed, and a family that was planning to sell the land for residential development without any environmental disclosure. Miles listened without interrupting. His face grew increasingly serious. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said slowly, "that land is a Superfund site waiting to happen. The cleanup costs would exceed the property's value by a factor of 5 or 10, possibly more. The family would be facing massive civil liability, criminal charges for failure to disclose, and federal fines that could bankrupt them. What if someone had collected soil samples?" I asked carefully, "What if they had evidence? Where would the samples come from?" Miles asked, "From someone with geotechnical expertise, someone who had access to the property." Miles studied me for a long moment. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. He knew this wasn't hypothetical. But he also understood that I was asking him a legal question, not making a confession. "The EPA has protocols for anonymous reporting," he said finally. "They accept reports from concerned citizens or employees. They have their own geotechnical teams that can conduct independent testing. If the initial report is credible, they can conduct a preliminary assessment. If that assessment shows contamination, they can proceed to a full environmental audit. And if the contamination is real," I asked, "then the property is essentially seized." Miles said, "Any sale is halted. The owners are liable for cleanup. The property becomes a liability instead of an asset. Depending on the severity, it could take years and millions of dollars to remediate." I nodded slowly. "Thank you," I said. "Daniel." Miles said, his voice careful, "Whatever you're thinking about doing, make sure you understand the consequences. For you, but also for everyone involved." "I understand," I said, and I did. I spent 3 days preparing my resignation from Thorne Industries. But before I resigned, I needed to secure my future. I had spent 5 years trapped by my family's financial manipulation, forced into poverty by their emergencies, kept dependent through calculated crisis. I would never be trapped again. I reached out to an old colleague from my New York days, a partner at a major architectural and engineering consulting firm that worked on complex industrial remediation projects. I didn't tell him the entire story, but I told him enough. I told him I was available for full-time employment. To my surprise, he didn't ask for a long interview process. He knew my reputation. He knew my work. He remembered the brilliant young engineer I had been before I came home to help my family. "We're establishing a new division focused on environmental remediation and industrial site risk assessment," he told me over a video call. "We need someone with deep structural engineering knowledge who understands environmental protocols. It's based in Portland. Significant salary, complete relocation package, and the work is genuinely important. When would you need an answer?" I asked. "We can move fast," he said. "If you're interested, I can have an offer letter to you by Monday." I accepted on Monday morning. I signed the contract Tuesday evening. Wednesday morning, I walked into Thorne Industries for the last time. My father found me packing my personal items from the small office I had used for 5 years. His face went red with immediate rage. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "We need you here. The buyers are coming next week. The closing is scheduled." I didn't look at him. I simply continued placing my tools into the lockbox. "I'm pursuing a new engineering opportunity," I said calmly. "I've accepted a full-time position with a firm based out of Portland. I'm relocating immediately." "You can't leave," my father said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that I had never heard from him before. Daniel, you can't do this. What about the factory? I turned and looked at him directly for the first time in 5 years. I saw him clearly then, not as the authoritative father figure of my childhood, but as a desperate, terrified man who understood that his grand plans were about to collapse and he had no idea why. Vivian can take care of the factory, I said. It's her legacy now. I set the lockbox on the floor and extended my hand to my father. Thank you for the opportunity to work here, I said. I hope everything works out with the sale. He didn't shake my hand. He simply stared at me, and I could see the moment he realized something was terribly wrong. You did something, he whispered. What did you do? I walked out without answering. I filed the anonymous report with the Environmental Quality Board the same day I signed my new employment contract. I included the faded regulatory filings from the 1980s. I included photographs of the backlot, the deteriorating storage drums, the faded warning labels still visible on the warehouse exterior. I included my soil sample analysis, rigorous, professional, peer-reviewed by Miles, who had connected me with a certified geotechnical engineer who was willing to validate the samples without knowing their origin. The report was concise, comprehensive, and absolutely irrefutable. I submitted it electronically at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday evening from my personal computer in my home office, using a VPN and an encrypted email service that would make tracing the source technically possible but practically difficult. Then I packed my belongings and drove north toward Portland. I didn't look back. My parents' panic began exactly 1 week later. My phone lit up with frantic calls from my father, my mother, and even Vivian, all within a span of 30 minutes. The buyers are asking about waste permits. My father's voice was barely coherent. Daniel, they're asking about environmental compliance. They're saying something about regulatory filings. Did you say something to them? Did you tell anyone? I didn't answer. I let the call go to voicemail. My mother called next, her voice a mixture of rage and terror. Daniel, if you did this, you will destroy this family. We will have nothing. Do you understand what you've done? I turned off my phone. By that evening, I had blocked all 3 of them. Every call, every text message, every email was immediately deleted. I had instructed Miles to inform them that any further contact attempts would result in legal action. I was finally completely free from their reach. The storm arrived exactly 14 days after I filed a report. My father called from an unknown number. I should have blocked it. Instead, I answered. There are people here, he said. His voice was hollow, barely recognizable. 3 vehicles. Men in suits with official badges. They're taking soil samples from the backlot. They have equipment. They're drilling. What did you do, Daniel? I could hear the sound of heavy machinery in the background, the mechanical whine of drilling equipment, the official voices of EPA agents conducting what would eventually become a full environmental assessment. You should talk to Roy's dad, I said quietly. He's a real estate expert. Maybe he can help you navigate this. My father made a sound that was almost a sob. Then the line went dead. The official findings arrived exactly 42 days after the EPA began their initial assessment. The land beneath Thorn Industries was contaminated with industrial solvents, heavy metals, and toxic compounds that had been leaching into the groundwater for decades. The contamination extended beyond the factory's property line into neighboring properties. The estimated cleanup cost exceeded $47 million. The land was immediately placed under an administrative hold by the Environmental Quality Board. No sale could proceed. No development could move forward. The property transformed from an asset worth $15 million into a liability that threatened to bankrupt the family. The buyers, terrified of legal liability, canceled the purchase immediately. Royce's real estate firm, which had staked its entire business model on the Thorn Industries land deal as their flagship project, faced immediate lawsuits from investors who felt deceived. Within 6 weeks, they were forced to file for bankruptcy. My sister's comfortable life, the expensive furniture, the country club membership, the illusion of success vanished overnight. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning when a local newspaper published a story that had been leaked to them by Royce's furious, scorned wife. Prominent local businessman's affair with mother-in-law exposed. Castellano Real Estate CEO Royce Castellano and Amelia Thorne, wife of retired factory owner Walter Thorne, found in compromising situation. Source: Vivian Castellano, wife of Castellano, filed for divorce Tuesday morning, citing infidelity and fraudulent business practices. The photograph was grainy but unmistakable. Royce and my mother, embracing in the darkness of the backlot, captured by my security camera feed and leaked to the press by my lawyer. My mother's face appeared on the front page of the local business section. The woman who had spent 35 years cultivating a reputation as a devoted wife and community leader was suddenly exposed as an adulteress, a financial conspirator, and a fraud. Walter, humiliated publicly, filed for divorce within days. Vivian, divorced and bankrupt, was forced to move into a small apartment across town. My parents, facing not just financial ruin but social ostracism, eventually sold their beloved family home to cover legal bills. They ended up in a modest townhouse on the outskirts of the city, a place no one from their former social circle would ever visit. 6 months after filing the environmental report, I received a call from my supervisor at the remediation firm. "We need you to lead a new division," she told me. "Environmental risk assessment and industrial site remediation. You'll be heading a team of 12 geotechnical engineers and environmental specialists. Your specialization, understanding structural failures in contaminated environments, is exactly what we need. You'll also be consulting on major projects across the Pacific Northwest." I had been promoted in record time. I had been given a team, a budget, and the authority to shape an entire division. The man my family had called a burden had become indispensable. The man my father had told was too soft had engineered the most comprehensive environmental remediation of the decade. The man my mother had publicly humiliated had become the expert everyone wanted to hire. I returned to my hometown exactly 1 year after leaving. I didn't go to see my family. I didn't have any desire to see the wreckage of their lives or hear their pleas for forgiveness. Instead, I went to finalize the sale of my small house, the house I had mortgaged 5 years ago to finance my failed architecture project, the house I had kept even after my family's crisis, the house I had worked night shifts to maintain. I had paid off the mortgage with my first year's salary from the remediation firm. As I drove away from the realtor's office, I took a detour past Thorne Industries. The factory was shuttered now, surrounded by yellow and black warning tape. Hazardous waste site, NO unauthorized entry. Heavy equipment was parked in the back lot. Massive excavators designed to remove contaminated soil. A temporary EPA office had been established in one of the old outbuildings. The factory that had consumed 5 years of my life, that had kept me poor, desperate, and dependent, was now a monument to environmental justice, a cautionary tale for business schools and regulatory agencies, a place where the corruption had been exposed and the perpetrators had faced consequences. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no revenge. I only felt profound, unshakable peace. For months later, I received a letter. It was from my mother. She had tracked down my mailing address through an old friend and had written to me in her own handwriting, not through a lawyer. "Daniel, I don't know if you'll even read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away without opening it. I deserve that. I know what you did. Walter figured out months ago when he realized the timing, how you left, and the EPA report came immediately after. He told me he understood that you had reported the environmental situation. I spent so long being angry about that. I spent months telling myself that you had betrayed us, that you had been cruel and vindictive. But last week, I had to sit in a courtroom for the bankruptcy proceedings. I had to listen to the judge explain that if we had disclosed the contamination in the first place, if we had been honest about what we knew, we might have had options, legal options, financial restructuring options. Instead, we chose to hide it. We chose to let you fix it, to use your skills and your labor for free, to keep you trapped here because we were too proud and too greedy to tell the truth. I realized that what you did wasn't cruel. It was justice. It was the consequence we deserved. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. Your mother, Amelia. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in a drawer and never looked at it again. Understanding wasn't forgiveness. Remorse was a redemption. Some relationships break in ways that can't be repaired. I stand in my office now, a bright, modern space overlooking the Portland skyline, with a view of the city that sprawls beneath me like a puzzle I'm learning to solve. My team consists of brilliant engineers and environmental specialists who respect my work and my expertise. My firm has contracted me for a major remediation project in the industrial district, one that will take 2 years and create hundreds of jobs. I make more money than I ever thought possible. I have savings. I have financial security. I have a life that is entirely my own. The man they called a burden became the man who cleaned up their mess, not because he forgave them, but because he refused to be destroyed by them. The man who was told he was too soft designed an environmental audit so comprehensive that it became a model for the EPA's future investigations. The man who was disinherited built a career on exposing the exact crimes his family committed. I didn't seek revenge. I sought justice. And in the seeking of justice, I found my own freedom. I walked away from a toxic family not to punish them, but to save myself. And in the end, the consequences they faced were simply the natural result of their own choices. I owe them nothing, and I have finally stopped paying. If you've made it this far, you understand. Respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by the expensive dinner I paid for, or the cruel word burden my father used. My story proves that silence can be a weapon, and patience, the patience to wait for the exact moment to expose the environmental contamination, can be devastating power. If this resonated with you, if a family has gaslit you into professional invisibility because they needed a free engineer, tell yourself this: your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Never let them mortgage your skill for their criminal schemes. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. They left me nothing. I made sure they were left with a multi-million-dollar liability instead. Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.